Why don't we just get rid of the United Nations and the veto power instead of getting rid of the United States? I mean, doesn't it seem radical to remove the US instead of just removing the veto power or dissolving the United Nations?
I mean, with regards to disbanding the UN, uh, as I said before, the United States has wanted to control the United Nations because they know that the United Nations has the power and has the potential to hold nations accountable for breaking international law. They have the potential, they have the power, they have the mandate for holding nations accountable for committing war crimes and crimes against humanity and so on. This is why they want to control it, because they know that they want to commit those crimes. Now, if you disband the UN, you have removed from the global stage any mechanism for holding them accountable. This is a dream scenario for the United States. This is a dream scenario for the neocons. They would rather there be a world in which no one can ever even possibly hold them accountable. They would love for there to be no institution available on the global stage that can hold them accountable. So if you're talking about disbanding the UN, then all you're doing is advocating for American impunity and American unaccountability. It makes no sense whatsoever. As I've said many times, the UN Charter is a very good charter. It has very noble principles that everyone in the world agrees with. That if you don't agree with the principles of the UN Charter, I don't know what's wrong with you. The principles are very good. The contract is very good. The problem isn't the contract. The problem is the one who's breaking the contract. The problem isn't the promise. The problem is the promise breaker. And you have to hold that promise breaker accountable. You have to hold the one who's not fulfilling the terms of the contract. You have to hold them accountable. You know, like I said, the comparison I made is when you have an outlaw in those old Western movies who becomes the sheriff of a town. That the town then doesn't then conclude, well, there's a problem with law. The whole problem is the whole concept of law and order. No, the problem is that you have a criminal who's in charge of enforcing the law. You have to remove that criminal, and then you enforce the law. And you enforce the law, most importantly, against that criminal who has been preventing you from enforcing the law. And the only way that we can do that on the international stage is by removing the United States from the United Nations, so that the United Nations, which is the internationally recognized and the international body that has the mandate and has the global consensus to enforce international law. So if you get rid of that organization, if you get rid of that institution, well, then you have nothing left. You have no one who will enforce the law. You have no one who will enforce international law. You have no one who will enforce international treaties and obligations and so on. You'll have none of that. You will have just your solution to having a criminal with a sheriff's badge. Your solution is to just have anarchy and to say, well, we're not going to have law and order anymore, and everyone is going to become outlaws. Well, what kind of a solution is that? You're going to make the situation immeasurably worse when you don't even have to go through all of those measures, not to mention the fact that you can't anyway, that then the whole thing becomes a theoretical, hypothetical discussion. We're talking about reality here. We're talking about real world solutions, not theory and not hypothetical situations. Article 6 exists in the United Nations Charter. It's a legal document. It can be activated and it can be implemented against the United States. There's no reason why it can't be. And in fact, what Sister Iman was talking about and Sister Nisa before, and I believe Brother Farouk, about the frequency of America's usage of the veto power just over the last couple of years is indicative of the fact that the rest of the world is turning away from the United States, which indicates that we have a greater chance of actually invoking Article 6 against the United States at the UN and getting them expelled from that organization, so that then that organization can impose accountability and consequences for America's actions.
And we did get a comment that says it's a sign of madness to see someone try something again and again and expect a different result. But the thing is, Article 6 has never been invoked.
Let me also just say something quickly about that phrase, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. As I said before, we're talking about the real world, and we're talking about real world practical solutions. So spare me the axioms that you've heard online and think that they make sense. Because if you actually think that through, it doesn't make sense. First of all, what Sister Iman said is correct. It hasn't been done before, so it doesn't apply. But you're just trying to quote something that you saw on Instagram to sound wise and intelligent when you haven't even thought it through yourself. Well, this live and this movement is for thinking people, because if you say if you do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, so therefore that's madness. No. What if you're talking about being a prisoner and you're chipping away at the prison walls? Well, you keep doing the same thing again and again and again until you break through and you get a result. Sometimes you have to do the same thing again and again. And I'm telling you, if we are in this campaign, we are in this campaign until we get the result. Even if we have to try multiple times and have to keep going multiple times. And if we take it to the Security Council and get shot down, then we're going to come back again next year and get it to the Security Council and get them to vote on it again. Sometimes it's not about madness because you keep doing the same thing over and over again. It's called persistence, and that gets results.
Someone did comment, would there be any negative impact on American citizens if the US was to be removed from the United Nations? And that is actually a question we have an answer to. So what would be the impact on American citizens? Would it be impactful in a negative way or a positive way?
America's violations have not only occurred overseas. It's not only violations that they've committed abroad. They're committing violations on a daily basis against their own citizens, against their own people. The American people are largely ignorant of this fact. The American people are largely ignorant about what their rights are under international law, and they think for some reason, it's from the American arrogance and hubris, which they themselves are actually a victim of, to where they think that international law doesn't apply to them. But thinking that international law doesn't apply to the United States is only beneficial to the rulers of the United States, and by the rulers I don't necessarily mean the government. I mean the private sector. I mean power. The interests of power in the United States. It's in their interest to be dismissive of international law, but it's absolutely catastrophic for the American people themselves to be dismissive of international law, because you have no other recourse for justice in your country than recourse to international law. You should be able to go, for example, when there are those extrajudicial killings by the security forces in the United States that are targeted specifically towards so-called minority communities. And by minority communities, let's just be clear what we mean. A minority community, so-called minority community in the United States, is nothing but members of the global majority who live in the United States. People of African descent or Latino descent or Asian descent and so on. They're part of the global majority and they happen to live in the United States. So when those communities are targeted by the security forces, the people who are responsible for those extrajudicial killings should be held accountable, not by the courts of that state. They should be held accountable by The Hague. They should be accountable for in the International Criminal Court, because what they're doing is nothing short of a form of ethnic cleansing. They're doing the same thing. Your police over there, your so-called police over there in the United States, are exactly the same as colonial security forces in colonized countries all around the world. They're exactly the same. They're treating the people who are the descendants of people from the global South the same way that they treat the current people in the global South. You understand what I mean? Black and brown people, non-white people, non-Christian people, and so on, who live all around the world in colonized countries. Well, anyone who looks like them and who lives in the United States gets treated the same way that their security forces treat them over in Africa, in so-called Latin America, or in Asia. They treat you the same. They look at you the same way that they look at you when you're in your country of origin as they look at you when you're on the streets of New York or Florida or wherever else. They look at you the same and they treat you the same. It's exactly a kind of ethnic cleansing, because they're ethnically cleansing their country by means of extrajudicial killing and by means of detention, because you have a mass incarceration problem in the United States. You have a mass incarceration criminal organization in the United States. You have 25%. This is an absolutely startling, outrageous statistic. That the United States, the entire population of the United States, accounts for only about between 3 to 5% of the entire global population. Yet, 25% of everyone on Earth who's in prison is in prison in America. 25% of everyone in prison is in prison in America. That is an ethnic cleansing system. They're moving people out of the communities. They're moving people out of the population and putting them in detention centers. And then, on top of that, as if that wasn't bad enough, they're making them work for free. It's slave labor. They make them work for free for the profit interests of private enterprise. Well, you don't know this. And the reason you don't know this is because you're American. And as an American, you are made to be ignorant about your rights under international law. But this is a violation of international law. It's a violation of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's a violation of the United Nations Covenant on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. It's a violation of the United Nations Convention on Civil and Political Rights. Your rights are being violated in the United States on a daily basis, and you have nowhere to go for your rights. You have nowhere to go for justice except to go to the people who are committing the violations against you. That's the way they've set up the system. And because they've made you alienated from international law and from understanding international law, and because they have dominated the United Nations, you can't even go to the United Nations, which is exactly where you're supposed to go. You're supposed to be able to go to the United Nations. You're supposed to be able to go to the ICJ. You're supposed to be able to go to the ICC. Those people who murder black and brown people in the United States, those so-called police, those security forces who are targeting your communities, they're supposed to be tried for crimes against humanity. They're not supposed to be tried in a court of their peers in Minnesota, in Kansas, in Missouri, or wherever else. They're supposed to be tried at The Hague in the Netherlands.
Exactly. They're basically domestic military force. They're the domestic military force of America.
Precisely. And they operate this exact same way as they do overseas and against the same people. They operate against the same people in the same way. It's completely consistent. And you're supposed to have recourse to international law. So if the United States gets removed from the United Nations, you would have recourse to international law. You would have recourse to the United Nations. Because the United Nations now, the same way that they have to look the other way when America commits crimes all around the world, they have to look the other way when America commits crimes right outside the headquarters of the General Assembly, right there in New York. They have to look the other way when they commit crimes domestically, the same way that they have to look the other way when they commit crimes overseas. And that wouldn't be the case if you can get the United States removed from the United Nations, and the United Nations would have the power and the mandate to hold America accountable. So it is in your interests, absolutely.